Okay, thanks everyone for attending today. Today is the last of a four-part series on coolOrange software capabilities. In the past 3 weeks, we've discussed both Power Jobs and Power Events. Our first webcast was how it could help with consumable file generation like step files, PDF files, etc. The second webcast was Power Jobs for communicating with other business systems. Last week we talked about how Power Events and Hagerman's Lifecycle connection software can let you customize reactions to various Vault events. And today follows in that same vein, less about lifecycle transitions and more about the other events that that Power Events can hook into. And the context I decided for this was ensuring data integrity. So there are lots of things you can do with Power Events, and so this is by no means, exhaustive, but these are just, again, some real-world scenarios, I think, of where Power Events could help your processes. So today we're going to start, again, I've provided this introduction each week just for the benefit of those who didn't attend any other webcasts. We'll talk a little bit about coolOrange and Power Events and how it works, and then we'll get into a review of some of the capabilities so you can see some of the behavior in action. So this will probably be a fairly short webcast. There's not a lot to see in terms of what it does. It's more showing you what can be done. And again, if you've got questions as we go, especially questions about capabilities, please type those questions into the question pane, and I'll do my best to answer them either as we go or at the end of the presentation. So again, coolOrange, founded in 2009 by former Autodesk employees. The folks at coolOrange, I think, are the closest you're ever going to get to, people that like Autodesk developers that aren't actually Autodesk. They have had hundreds of successful projects worldwide. If there's a single third-party product aside from the Hagerman products, which I think are great, other than us, if there's a single third-party product you're considering for Vault, coolOrange is going to be your best source for that, just because they're so closely tied to the Vault product, and they've had just so much success worldwide. Now, today we're going to be talking about Power Events specifically, and again, as a reminder, coolOrange offers a whole suite of products assisting in various different aspects of Vault management and implementation, from loading data with their BCP toolkit that helps you use the Vault data transfer utility, or helps maybe a reseller or a consultant use that to more reliably import files from disk or from another competitive system, or especially merging Vaults together. They offer Power Events and Power Jobs to enhance Vault workflows and processes. Again, the webcast the last few weeks and today have been focusing on this enhanced portion. And then the connect portion, PowerGate, which enables bi-directional communication between Inventor, between Vault, and other business systems. So there's just a really broad range of things that coolOrange can provide when it comes to working with Vault, integrating Vault with other systems, and starting out with Vault as well. So getting into Power Events now specifically, last week we focused on lifecycle behaviors and how, when you make a lifecycle transition in Vault, how Power Events can react to that transition and determine whether or not it should be allowed, or as a result of that transition, take some other action, automating things. Right now, today's webcast is going to focus more about other types of events, not lifecycle events, but the other kinds of events that you can hook into. And they are a little bit trickier to use, I will say that, but if you need to react, you know, to things like adding files to Vault, or checking a file back into Vault, or checking out a file, for example, or react to a change order event. You know, powerEvent can do those sorts of things as well. So for example, you know, setting or clearing properties. This is something you've done on a lifecycle transition, but it can also be done as a response to adding a file to Vault. A good example would be a file type that Vault can't understand if there's no content source provider, so you can't map properties from that file, but you want to make sure the Vault record has its user-defined properties somehow set. powerEvents could help with that. So, you know, for example, based on maybe the folder it's added to and some part of its file name, maybe there's a lookup that sets some properties, or it could, again, working with PowerShell, so it could even be a database. You know, if you know, based on a file name, you've got some extended properties in a database somewhere and you want to get that data into Vault, you know, you could add that data as files get added versus, you know, trying to do it all at once. You could prevent file import. So you could say, we don't want any text files in our Vault, or we don't want people trying to add, you know, BAK files from AutoCAD stuff into Vault. Maybe they think they need to keep them. We don't want them in here. You could add an add files restriction that said if the extension is .bak, don't let it in. You can create links between files automatically. I've got an example of that today. And maybe even intelligent job queuing. Again, last week we discussed how with lifecycle events, you could, you know, you can always add custom jobs onto the stack with Power Jobs, but maybe depending on certain properties or certain situations, it's not always the same job every time when you transition. The same could hold true for powerEvents outside of a lifecycle transition. If something happens, you know, so for example, if properties change and you need to make sure a new consumable version of a file gets generated, changing file properties technically is a check-in of a changed version of the file. And so you could react to that and potentially determine if you needed to throw a job on the stack to make a new PDF of that document, for example. So, you know, often you would still tie that to a lifecycle transition. Hopefully, you know, you're using those life cycles to, you know, maintain revision control of the documents, and as part of that transition, you know, you'd throw a job on the stack, but you wouldn't have to with powerEvents, which is kind of the neat thing. So again, getting back to how it works, it is an add-in. Technically, there's an add-in for Vault Explorer, I guess. That's where the files are located. But what's interesting, as we'll see today, it's not just Vault Explorer that gets impacted, right? Because of the nature of how Autodesk has architected its ability to hook into these events, any software that uses that Vault library, so really any Vault add-in, so the add-in for Inventor, the add-in for AutoCAD, the Vault client itself, or even some third-party application that you may have written or someone else wrote that uses that web services reference, the events would still fire in that case. And so it really is an extremely capable piece of software, and you don't have to jump through a lot of extra hoops to make it broadly apply to what you're doing. That could be a pro or a con, as I found this week as I was preparing the webcast, because, you know, when a check-in, for example, or an add of a file happens from an application, or really from any application, the custom event you write is going to fire. And so your events really need to take that into account, and they may need to be intelligent enough to make sure that they're acting on a file when they need to versus when they're not. But aside from what it is, how it works, and this is again the anatomy of a web service call in Vault, and this is how Autodesk has architected their web service calls. There's a get restrictions event, which essentially says, is this web service call supposed to happen? Is it allowed to happen? So, for example, that's where, in the case of an out-of-the-box lifecycle transition, it would check for all the actions on the Actions tab, like have dependent child files been released? Or if it's an item, is the linked files, match the version of the latest linked file, like updated to the item, etc. And this is your opportunity to, with powerEvents, add your own restrictions and say, no, even though in all other cases, as far as everything else is concerned, this should happen, my event says it can't, and you can stop the web service call completely in its tracks and nothing happens after that, right? So you're saying, no, user, you can't do this, and here's why. If the restrictions get passed, there is a pre-event which allows you to take some actions that need to take place before the web service call. I played around a little bit this week with inventor files and trying to restrict add of data, or not necessarily restrict, but massage information during this process. It's especially if you're reacting to like a check-in event or something. I mean, maybe you need something to happen in the pre-event, but still, I think like with the lifecycle, usually you're reacting to the fact that a lifecycle state has changed or an event has happened. So most of that's going to have, what you're going to do is probably going to happen in the post. So if you can think of something that needs to happen or needs to take place before the web service call, the actual act in Vault of like the actual check-in or the actual add of the file, if there's something you need that needs to be done or in place before that call happens, you can hook into it and take that action. But in all the real-world things that I've been thinking of, at least, and not a lot has come to mind for the pre, but there are a lot of things you might want to do in response to something happening, in response to a file being added, in response to a file being checked in, right? And so that's really most of what we're going to cover today. If it's not a restriction, it's something that happens in response to this other Vault action taking place. So to hook into these events and react to them or prevent them, your custom event code is being written in PowerShell. Again, PowerShell is a scripting language. I've learned a whole lot about it in the last few weeks working on these webcasts. It is extremely powerful. You get access to, really any .NET assembly that would include the Inventor and AutoCAD APIs. And one of my examples today, I am actually using the Inventor API in an event call in order to enforce a restriction. We'll see that in a minute. And it also can leverage PowerVault, which we'll see an example of that today too. PowerVault is a native PowerShell extension maintained by coolOrange. Again, we've been over this the last few weeks. But it dramatically simplifies some of the Vault actions. And I've got a really good example of that today where coding it from scratch using the Vault API would take quite a few lines of code and a lot of knowledge of the Vault API. But with PowerVault, it's literally like 2 lines of code. And it's just fantastic. And again, the cool thing about PowerVault is it is free to use. It does, work best in conjunction with something like PowerJobs or powerEvents to put it to use, but nothing would prevent you from using that PowerShell extension to connect to your Vault and to interact with a Vault on demand or like on a scheduled task, for example. So that's it for powerEvents and what it is and coolOrange and who they are. So let's get into some of our scenarios now. The first scenario I came up with, it may be a bit of a stretch for powerEvents, but you know, it's a different way of enforcing data integrity. Again, these scenarios are all about enforcing data integrity in your vault, meaning we need to make sure that the right information gets into Vault, or it gets in the right way, or you know, invalid information doesn't get put in, or you know, maybe certain workflows that need to take place are enforced. You know, Vault, for better or worse, you know, I think for the better, it does allow a savvy user to work around some things potentially. And when you get into a large user group, it can be more important than ever to enforce certain workflows or certain restrictions, just to make sure that the other processes, especially downstream processes, execute the way they're supposed to, right? And one of the most fundamental ones is, you know, where information originates is really, you know, where it should be added to the process, and it shouldn't be, you know, necessarily manipulated after the fact. So, you know, if we're talking about someone creating a new CAD document, if they're responsible for describing that part or that thing they're making, we really should collect that description from them, you know, before there's an opportunity for the process to continue without that information, right? Now, the data standard, which is coincidentally something that coolOrange wrote and now provides to Autodesk, it's a default component for Vault. The data standard is a pretty good way of enforcing that information, that it gets captured, say, when a file goes into Vault. But some people find it a bit too restrictive. It's a little, you know, it can be a little overbearing. You know, when you first hit the save button on a new document in Inventor, for example, it's going to bring that data standard dialog up. It's going to force you to, you know, pick a location in the Vault for that file and fill out certain properties. And, you know, some people, like, they see it, but they're like, yeah, I'm not sure I really want something that in my face or overbearing. Well, you could instead use powerEvents to still allow the user to work how they normally would. They should go to the iProperties and fill out the description, or, you know, call up an iLogic form you've created. But in case they didn't, we want to make sure they can't check the file in until they do so, right? So that's the first scenario, and there's not a whole lot to see with it, you know, other than, you know, I've got a file here, I just created it, I've saved it, or I could even just make a whole new one from scratch, right? And I do not have the data standard loaded in this case, so nothing's going to prevent me, potentially, nothing's going to force me to go to my iProperties and save this document, or put a description in. But we need to make sure that a description always gets included with our files, right? So I'm going to say it's already been saved. I'm not going to go to my iProperties, but I'm just going to try to check this guy in. And I'm hooking into the get restrictions event of adding a file to Vault. And so it looks like everything's going to be good, but when I finally hit OK, it's going to tell me, no, you can't do that, right? So a problem occurred. The server returned the following information from powerEvents. For this part, description property must be provided. So it didn't force me to fill that in information. I was able to save it in my local workspace and keep working. I didn't have to come up with it right away. But now when I'm ready to check it in, we want to make sure that value gets there. And once I go and fill something out, then I should be able to check the file in without any issue. So that's a pretty simple example, but it can be a very powerful one, because again, you're letting the user work with freedom and without something like in their face, but you're still ensuring data integrity, making sure that every file that ever goes into Vault, or maybe every Inventor file, for example, that goes into Vault, has a description property before you let it in. Right? So that's one example. Now, the second example is a little more complicated. It's a little more nuanced, and I'm discussing this partly because it may or may not be, the way I approached it at first may or may not be a best practice. So if you are planning to get powerEvents and do a lot of scripting on your own, I thought I'd throw in maybe sort of something I learned, at least. But this is another, I would say, somewhat common need. You need to make sure that, especially if you're using a particularly picky PLM system or ERP system, maybe there are certain characters that just aren't allowed, right? So for example, in this case, you know, our descriptions often contain dimensional information like cut sizes or something. But at the same time, our ERP system, for whatever reason, it doesn't allow forward slashes. And our users are pretty used to putting in inch-based dimensions with forward slashes if they're fractional. So, and we can try to remind our users, make sure, you know, you use an underscore instead. Maybe that's the character we've decided to replace it with. But people are going to forget, right? And so at some point in the process, if you're automating, you know, this behavior, like maybe pushing data to PLM, you need to make sure that these characters get filtered out somehow. There's lots of ways you could do it. Here's one way, using powerEvents. So in this case, even from Inventor, if I've got a file, say this document here, where its description contains fractions with forward slashes, when I check that file into Vault, I can have an event run in the background that automatically does that replacement of the forward slash with an underscore, right? So it checked into Vault. It didn't tell me that anything was necessarily wrong or anything like that. So as far as the user's concerned, I'm done and I didn't make any mistakes. But without filtering and replacing that information, we'd have some trouble downstream. And so you can see I refreshed my Vault here, and if I look at this description of that file here in the Vault, it did not come in with the forward slashes, right? It came in with underscores. So it automatically filtered that data out to make sure it wasn't a problem. So technically I was able to do that. One of the downsides of this, though, is just fundamentally how Vault works. I had to wait for the file to get into Vault, and I had to change its property. So there was technically a new version created for that property edit. And from what I can tell, there's no way around that. We can't manipulate the Inventor file during the check-in process. You don't want to do that. You can't do it anyway. And so you have to wait until the file gets in. So the downside of that is a new version of the file got created. So if I refresh my Vault view here, you can see I technically don't have the latest version. That version in Vault that had the property edit is the latest version. Now I can pretty easily refresh my file, right, and get the latest version. But again, that could be confusing to some users. So when it comes to manipulating property information, especially if it's from something like Inventor, where there's a mapping and you're potentially going to be checking in from a workspace and you could keep a copy in your workspace, you may want to avoid going this route. It's probably better to react on a lifecycle state change, or maybe use the data standard to enforce that, or maybe iLogic, would always be a possibility. Every time you save the document, for example, just automatically replace forward slashes with underscores. A lot of different ways to accomplish it. But manipulating properties of other documents that you add to the system, like if you just drag and drop a Word document in, for example, or any other file type, you could absolutely, update the Vault properties of that record so that the Vault properties themselves are up to date. And especially when you're adding files the first time, it could be a real time saver, as long as you've got some way to determine what the properties of that document should be. Now, the third scenario is data cleanup. I think I really like this one. One of the biggest struggles with Vault is when you're first starting out, taking your maybe years or even decades of legacy data and getting it into the Vault, and getting it into the Vault in a way that it can participate in your new workflows that are supposed to be helping you out, right? You know, most companies I've worked with, they've had, you know, lots of users over the years. Maybe their primary power user has changed over the years, and as a new person who is the inventor guru comes in, you know, they decide they're going to do things a certain way, and then that changes over time. And so you can, sometimes you can end up with a real hodgepodge of how things were done. This might also apply to, you know, a company that's been using Vault for a long time, and maybe they acquire another company that wasn't using Vault or was using Vault in a different way, and you need to get data into your Vault, but it needs to be cleaned up. It can be a struggle to do all of that cleanup up front before you get it into your Vault. You know, I've known companies to work literally for weeks trying to clean up data, only to find when they tried to import their supposedly now pristine data set, it still wasn't right. And so another approach to that whole process is, assuming you don't have fundamental issues like broken links, go ahead and put the data in the Vault anyway, even though it doesn't match perfectly, you know, the new standards you've set. But then over time, follow a process to, as you touch the data, go through a process to make it match the new standard, right? That can be a really good approach, right? Get the data in the Vault, so at least it's in the Vault and you've got it. You can use things like searching, and you're getting access control and check in, check out. But then over time, work toward that perfect data set. The problem with that is people get busy and they don't always necessarily follow the process. So what powerEvents can do is they can help enforce those processes. And here's a good example. Let's say we had a common practice in the past, especially before iLogic, where we linked a spreadsheet to our documents for parameters because we wanted to do a lot of complex calculations in a spreadsheet. It wasn't, you know, before iLogic was a thing, I think this was a lot more common. But now we want to transition, and we want to get rid of those linked spreadsheets because linked documents just cause more problems than they're really worth a lot of times. So our now mandate is, as we go ahead and load it all in anyway, and then as we go, transition so that, you know, when we have these linked spreadsheets, just make new parameters in the document and replace the references and maybe even replace some of the math. And yeah, it could be a lengthy process, but we've decided there's benefit to that. And we just want to get rid of these extra links, right? But again, people get busy, and especially if it's a somewhat onerous process, they're not going to want to do it. powerEvents can help enforce that. So I've got this file here with a spreadsheet attached. I'm going to check it out for edit, right? So it was in my Vault. I'm going to make a change to my geometry. Okay, it's all done. It's getting late on Friday. I really want to check this in, but I'm supposed to take the spreadsheet out. I'll do it later, right? Well, with powerEvents, check in and say, no, you can't do that, right? The file contains OLE links and cannot be checked in. And it even says, reference this standard procedure for how to properly remove links, right? So this is a pretty informative message. This says, you can't check this in because you didn't follow procedure. Here's the procedure if you need to know how to do it. Right? So that's where I'd have to now come in, okay, you're right, I really should have done that. So I would, take my new parameter and, set the rules however I needed to, delete the link so that it goes away, right? So I've followed my procedure now, and now I should be able to check that file into my Vault. There we go, right? So that was a pretty simple example of a process, but if other things are supposed to happen, if you've got a detailed process for cleaning up data, powerEvents can help enforce that. And just to kind of show you how that works in the script, like I was saying before, how you can interact with the software APIs because it's PowerShell. So I've just got a little PowerShell function here that checks for third-party links, right? So powerEvents can tell you what software is calling the event. This is coming from Inventor, right? And so I can say, you know, every time any other file is checked in, if it's not coming in from Inventor, don't worry about it. But if it is coming from Inventor, go ahead and get a reference to the Inventor document object, and then check to see if there are any not embedded, but specifically linked or unknown OLE references. So if someone embedded a spreadsheet, an embedded spreadsheet's not as bad, it's all encapsulated, right? So maybe we're only concerned about the linked stuff. So I can even get down to that level of detail, specifically look for linked spreadsheets and say, nope, they can't come in. Right? So, I mean, this is really not that much code here, but this is creating a hard enforcement of the processes that you've worked hard to develop and that you think are going to add value to your business, right? And you can apply this sort of restriction to lots of different things when it comes to wanting to clean up your data. Now, the last scenario is file linking in this case. So let's say we've got an example where, you know, we generate CAD files, of course, but we also, you know, use CAM. And let's say it's not HSM, let's say it's something else. And one of our goals is to make sure that we are maintaining machine code, like an NC file. And we want to make sure that those machine files are actually representative of what we're supposed to be building. And so we want to enact the process where we want to manage those NC files. We want to associate those with the related CAD documents. And we want to make sure that those NC files go through a review process just like the CAD documents. Right? That way we know when we you know, load up a program on a machine, it's going to make what we want it to make. But we also want to make sure, because our CAM users, maybe they're not Vault users, we want to make sure that everything's as simple as possible for them. Now, we could, you know, when we need to add a new NC file to the Vault, you know, we could add it to the Vault, we could find the associated file, we could, you know, go to the attachments and attach and search for the NC file that we just added and add it together. We could do all that. We could teach them how to do that. But with powerEvents, we can automate that entire thing, right? So I've got a file in here, this, you know, part number 10, and let's say as the CAM operator, I just finished up my master CAM program, it all looks good, so I'm ready to put that into the Vault for that new part so that I can go through the process. Well, as the CAM operator, all I have to do is take and drag and drop this file into Vault. That's going to be adding it to the Vault. And it's done. But if we look what happened here in our Vault now, we should be able to see it automatically attached that NC file. So I didn't have to do anything, right? And you can see just this morning, child reference is updated. So as the NC operator, as the CAM operator, I didn't have to do anything other than put that file in the Vault. And powerEvents found the appropriate part and attached the NC file to it. And then we can even use powerEvents now as this file goes through its life cycle to make sure that the NC file also has gone through a life cycle and has been reviewed, maybe before we release the part. And I was talking about Power Vault earlier and how it makes things so easy. Here literally is the code to make that happen. It's literally 3 lines of code, and it could have been shrunk down to 2. Essentially what we're doing is we're saying whatever the root name of the NC file is, find a file in the Vault whose part number matches that value, and if we find it, add as an attachment the NC file to the CAD file, right? So literally 2 or 3 lines of code can take away how many clicks, right? You know, tool like actions, attachments, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 clicks with 2 lines of code, right? And that's 6 clicks for every one of these files, plus someone could forget, right? Someone could attach the wrong file. Mistakes could be made, right? So those are the 4 scenarios that I had for powerEvents, not so much lifecycle, but reacting to things like checking in or adding files. Keep in mind the services we provide for powerEvents. We can sell you the software, of course, but we can also provide assistance with installation and configuration. We can create custom events for you based on your requirements. We can train you on how to do it and enable you so that you can maintain and create your own. And with that, we'll open it up for questions. I haven't seen really any questions come in as we've gone, so we'll take this opportunity now, give you a minute or two to type any questions, be they on the specific scenarios that I presented, or if you've got some things in mind for how powerEvents might help you, if you want to know if it's a good fit or not, you know, if it's a simple application, you could go ahead and type that in right now. We'll give everyone just a minute or two to ask some questions. Well, I'm not seeing anything come in, so hopefully that means I explained everything really well and answered every question before they were even asked. So, but if you've got questions after the presentation, you'll have an opportunity to type those in. You can also reach out to your Hagerman account manager for that. And just as a quick reminder before we go, we do more than just coolOrange and Inventor and stuff. We do document management in general. We represent multiple different data management systems, not just Vault. So if you've got some data management needs that are not yet met, give us a call. And we also provide simulation services, both analysis services themselves, software sales, and training. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ashley.
Thanks, Forrest. Yes, this will conclude our broadcast. If you think of additional questions later, you can simply reply to that confirmation or reminder email you received from GoToWebinar, and we can get those to the appropriate party. Once again, the survey will just pop up as we close down today. Thanks for attending, and have a great day, everybody.